So, here we are again with another 10 for Zen. And I would like to say good morning, everyone, but I'm not too sure at all. I have no idea what time of day it is that you will be listening to this at. So I will say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Take whichever one is appropriate. Today I would like to share with you some of my musings on longevity. Those of you who know me may well have heard me say at some point that I want to live to be 1,000. I want to live 1,000 years. That seems like a reasonable chunk of time for a lifetime. But I'm usually met with a kind of silence, certainly not met with enthusiasm. And that usually surprises me. Why is nobody enthusiastic about this? So then I think, well, if you think of someone you know who is 100 years old, or somebody that you've seen on TV, maybe they're being interviewed because they are 100 years old. They are usually very frail. Sometimes they can have their full mental faculties, and they'll usually be in a wheelchair or in bed, or if they can move around on their feet, it's with a lot of weakness. And so the impression that I get is nobody wants to live like that for 900 years. And that's not what I mean when I say I want to live to be 1,000. I mean I want to live 1,000 years in more or less my current state of health, which is physically fairly strong, mentally fairly strong, emotionally fairly positive. So when I say that, they begin to change. People say, oh, they're coming around to the idea, but they still find it difficult. So I would like to live 1,000 years. When I was living at Green Gulch, I'd only been there a year or so, maybe a little bit more, and my uncle was taken into hospital, so I went up to Canada to visit. And when I went to see him, he was sitting up in bed, he was watching golf. He'd been a golf player and was an enthusiast in watching the game. And he was talking about how the doctor said when he can walk down the corridor, they will send him home. And all the talk, all the conversations were about him getting out. So a few days after I came back to Green Gulch, he died. But when I met with him in the hospital, he did say something remarkable to me. He said, no matter how long you live, life is short. And I reflected on that and how true it is that if I did live to be 1,000 years, as those 1,000 years came to an end, I suspect I would want another 1,000 years. And so then my thinking changes, well, if I'm going to live 1,000 years in my current state of health, why not suppose that this is the end of 1,000 years? I'm in my last 100, or I'm in my last 50, or I'm in my last 10. So what would be the difference? The difference is there's 1,000 years behind you, or the best part, or there's 1,000 years in front of you, or the best part. So how do you feel about that? living for 1,000 years. In the Buddha's day, there was the notion, which was widespread, and still is, I think, in much of the world, of rebirth. But the rebirth that they had in mind was infinite. You would just keep coming back and living a life, and coming back and living a life, and coming back and living a life, and coming back and living a life. And this struck Siddhartha as being absurd. Well, he didn't use the word absurd, at least it doesn't translate into the Pali Canon or from the Pali Canon. But he saw it as tragedy, because no matter how often you play this game of life, it ends in death. It ends in lamentation and despair. It ends with tragedy. It ends. So this was a horrible situation. It ended with suffering. It ended with a heap of suffering. And his quest was to find a way out of it, as with other mendicants or wandering ascetics in his day. Eventually he came to experience nirvana, and when he experienced nirvana, he decided he would spend the rest of his life teaching how to get there. But in the course of that life, he would be tempted to go back to, let's call it civilian life, or family life, or clan life, where he would be a king, and he would rule with justice and so forth. But in each of these temptations, he would say to himself, this is the last birth. There is no more of this to come. So that was his way, or one way that he had, of staying on his path. And the question is, if this is your last decade of 1,000 years, how does that change your mentality? When I think of living for 1,000 years, I think 1,000 years of practice. At Zen Center, when we're having our meals in the Zendo, there are chants that go with it. And in one of the chants we say, we eat to support life and to practice the way of Buddha. So 1,000 years of practice. Are we at the start of that 1,000 years? Or are we at the end of that 1,000 years? In Zen mind, beginner's mind, Suzuki Roshi says, 100 years of life is good. 1 year of life is good. So the challenge as Zen practitioners, to me, is, can we live as though we're going to live for 1,000 years, and simultaneously live as though this year is our last year? So let me know what your thoughts are. Thank you all very much, and we'll be together again soon. Bye for now.